to do that. So welcome everyone to the fourth and final HOP Taster session of the series, HOP in Practice. So it's our pleasure to be hosting this webinar with our special guest, Craig Johnson. Craig's the Senior Manager of Safety, Health and Environment of the Asia Pacific region at CHEP. And CHEP's a household name in global logistics. So you might recognise their signature blue pallets in many an organisation. And a few years ago, CHEP made the decision to adopt human and organisational performance as an operating philosophy. And Craig's been leading the way in his regions with that. So like with any approach, it's really the ability to apply them practically that can hold the real gold. So Craig's with us today to be sharing his insights on how HOP is going in CHEP. There's going to be plenty of time for Q&A. If you have any throughout, please pop them in the Q&A box or in the chat. And we can raise those with Craig at the time or following his presentation. With that, I'll hand over to you, Craig.
Okay, thanks a lot, Vanessa. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to share with you our safety differently journey at CHEP so far. So I say so far because we've still got a long way to go down this path as a business, but hopefully some of the insights that we'll go through today will give you some ideas on how to get started with this and also how to build momentum and support. So firstly though, I'll tell you a little bit about myself so you know who's on the other end of the line. So I grew up in Byron Bay in New South Wales. I went to Mullum High in nearby, went to Queensland University and came out as a materials scientist. So I worked for a couple of years for BHP Steel in Whyalla as a metallurgist, doing product development projects and so forth, before moving into the operations field at the steelworks, looking at process optimization. From there, I actually moved into operations proper and worked as a shift manager, and then worked basically in operations. I must have got a taste for it, so I worked in operations management role for the next 16.5 years at BHP, BlueScope, and more recently CHEP, or not so recently, I suppose. So I've been at CHEP for 15 years. The first 8 of those were as a service centre manager across a couple of plants here in Sydney. And then for the last 7 years as a regional safety manager. So I currently look after the Asia Pacific region, which is predominantly Australia, New Zealand, China, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore. So that's who I am. And I've seen a couple of familiar faces on the call today, which is great to see. What I'm going to do is share some slides with you, and just to give you a bit of an outline of who we are, why we went down this path, and some of the ways that we progressed through safety differently and HOP. You'll hear me at different times mention safety differently, or mention HOP, or probably various other terms. I think, I'm not sure if people get too wrapped up in the subtleties between the approaches, but you know, whether it's HOP, safety differently, new view, safety 2, to me they all sort of work off the same premise, and that is coming to a realisation as an organisation that management doesn't necessarily have all the best ideas, and we need a better way of truly understanding what's going on in our business on the shop floor. And all of those approaches, you know, I come at that in slightly different ways, but to me they're pretty much the same fundamentally. So I'm going to share my screen and So Vanessa, have you, can you see that at the moment?
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, great. So who is CHEP? Look, just a really broad overview. So we're a global company. We're owned by Brambles, and we're in over 60 countries. We've got over 11,000 people working for us. 330 million assets. So most people know CHEP. I know when I'm out in gatherings and they say, who do you work for? And I'll say CHEP. The first question is, who are they? When I say the blue pallets, most people get it. But we do a range of materials handling platforms. Over 750 service centres globally. Here in Asia Pacific, we've got over 60. And basically, our business is about logistics and manufacturing. So we hire our products out, we bring them back, we refurbish them, we rehire them back out to customers. And probably many of you on the call have either are in businesses or have been in businesses that are sort of familiar with that hire base model that we run. So the sort of risks that we see within our business are not too different to the risks in most other manufacturing logistics businesses. We have manual handling, musculoskeletal risks from the repair processes, which are predominantly manual. We have machine access, so equipment safety risks, and also we have in our yards and also inside our factories, we have the pedestrian segregation with mobile plant risks. So a number of sort of risks common to many businesses. So why did we go down the path of safety differently? Basically, globally, our results for CHEP and Brambles were stagnating. So along with virtually every other company, globally, our core metrics were lag indicators. Our core one was the equivalent of TRIFR. They call it the BIFR, which is Brambles injury frequency rate, but it's the equivalent of TRIFR. And it was stagnating. It was actually getting worse globally. We're having particularly some big problems in the US with this. But Australia, in my region, it was also stagnating. And we needed to do something differently before we started to get worse. So we started by, as a global team, we'd heard about safety differently, and so we reviewed it as a global team, and we had the opportunity to engage, again, one of the global experts in this field, which was Sydney Decker. So we had a good session with Sydney Decker in Brisbane, and it convinced us that this was something that had merit. So where we took it from there was I started testing the process. I developed a slide deck, and that was with the help of Sydney Decker, Andrea Baker was another lady that helped us kick it off, but also Southpac here in Australia. Andy actually spent quite a bit of time with myself and my team doing training, and also allowing us to source some material that enabled us to develop a very short introductory deck that I could then use within the business. And that was one of the key things that enabled us to get, I suppose, wider scale buy-in, but also testing the waters throughout the company was developing a very short 1 hour long presentation to give people the nuts and bolts of what Safety Differently and HOP was all about. So the group that I tested this on was our health and safety leaders groups. For a number of years, we've in each of the states in Australia and in New Zealand, we get the health and safety reps together, to do some networking, some learning. So what I did was, I think the first group I presented it to was the Queensland group. And we've got Dave Hopner is on the call. Dave has since moved on from CHEP, but Dave played a critical role in facilitating that for us in Queensland. So we tested it with the health and safety leader groups, and what I found was the response was overwhelmingly positive from that cohort of people. They instantly connected with the fundamentals of HOP, and so that gave me the courage to then start to pitch it to the senior leadership team in Australia and New Zealand. So what we wanted to do again, before we committed to say, look, this was going to be a whole of region rollout, we wanted to start small, and so we chose a pilot region. The biggest message with all of this stuff is and I hope you sort of get the gist of that from what I'm talking about, is we very intentionally started small and then started to expand throughout the business. I didn't want this to be seen as the next big thing, and just saying something coming down from above and just saying, here it is, implement it, something off the shelf, and there you go. I knew that wouldn't work with this approach, so we started very small and then started to build momentum and build advocates throughout the business. So we did a pilot program in the Brisbane sites, and that ran from, as you see on there, January to March 2019. And the pilot basically consisted of 3-day formal training, initially with all of the service centre managers and all of my team in the region. We also had a couple of my global colleagues fly in for that training as well from overseas. We then followed that training up. So that was a 3-day training with Andy and the team. We then followed that up with 4 facilitated learning teams by Southpac as well. The other big thing with this is learning teams are a bit of an unknown on exactly how you conducted the learning team, how you got the benefits out of it. And so we wanted guys that had actually done this many times in a lot of businesses to show us how. So we actually had 4 learning teams. We did 2 in Brisbane, we did 1 in Sydney, and we did 1 in Melbourne at 4 different service centres. And my team sat in on those learning teams as observers to understand the process. The results out of the pilot were that all the service centre managers were wrapped in the process. The workers were wrapped in the process. The feedback we got, I remember one comment in the early days really stuck out to me, was a worker that had traditionally probably knocked heads with his supervisors and managers on many occasions, but he actually sent an email out to his regional manager and absolutely raving about the HOP approach, and he said it was the first time that he actually felt that someone had truly listened to what he had to say. The other big thing that came out was, it was actually quite stunning for us on some of the information that came out, and I'll go into a little bit more detail on in the learning team section. But what we found is it's the richness of the information. So it's not the sort of vanilla comments that you might get in a traditional continuous improvement exercise. Some of the stuff that comes out in learning teams is actually things that you know people would never have shared with you in other forums. So let's talk a little bit about learning teams. So some of you on the call may have done safety differently or HOP training before, and may have sort of heard about learning teams. Some of you might be doing learning teams at the moment. But essentially, a learning team is a it's based on the premise of trust. So the way that we set it up, we only have 3 or 4 workers, and depending on what the subject matter is, we try not to go too specific with the subject matter. We like to be able to give the exercise a bit of latitude to explore different areas. But you have a topic that you want to explore. It might be equipment jams, okay, as a general topic, or an example I did at our Lidcombe Service Centre was just yard operations. At Lidcombe, they wanted to try and improve yard operations, improve the safety of the operations, but they didn't quite know where to look, and so that's where we started, was just yard operations. What we then do is I show a very like a 10-minute quick and dirty overview of what HOP is and what the 5 principles are of HOP, and what we'll be doing in the learning team. And what we then emphasise over and over is that it's an environment of trust. So when we set up a learning team, it's in a closed meeting room. And we're still in this stage at the moment, but certainly in the early stages of rolling this out, we made sure that there was no one in the chain of command of anyone in the room that was part of the learning team. So if I had three workers, then their supervisor, their leading hand, their service centre manager, none of those could actually be part of that learning team. Because what you need to do is make sure that people understand that they can say anything within those walls in that time, and there'll be no personal repercussions. And it's really important to keep reiterating that with the team. When we start off the discussions in the learning team, it's the sorts of questions that you ask. I'll just grab some notes down here. The sort of questions you ask are there to generate stories from people. So you want people to tell you a story, and it doesn't matter if the person next to them starts, building on their story, and that this is not a one-on-one interview. You actually want that collaborative approach with the people that you're talking with. And the facilitator's role, which might be my team or some other people within the business, they're just there to keep the stories going. We generally have a note taker as well. We've found a little bit hard to facilitate and take notes at the same time. The other thing that we make very clear to everyone in the room is that the notes, and we write everything that is said as it's and how it's said. So if someone starts to tee off with the F-bombs, then you write that up on the board, because what you want to do is when you're reviewing the notes with the team, you want to see the emotion that's in there as well. But what we do say to them is that the butcher's paper that we put up on the walls, that's the team's to do with what they want to do. The only thing that we share outside the room is the consolidated themes that come out of those individual comments. And so we actually give the paper to the participants to take away themselves at the end of the session. So, and that, again, that reinforces the notion of trust. So if they say it, the detail of who said what won't be taken outside the room. So the sorts of things that we lead off with is things like, what works well here if we're using yard operations as the context of the learning team. What's working well in the yard? What do you really enjoy about working in the yard? What doesn't work so well in the yard? What frustrates you? Where is it easy to make a mistake in the yard? What do you think the worst thing that could happen if you do make a mistake in the yard is? So all those questions are open questions, and they're just designed to get people to reflect back on what their normal day is like in the yard operations or whatever the context is. Learning teams are about exploring normal work as potentially a way to avert an incident happening in the future. So the other thing that we also do in the learning teams is, it's part of the upfront spiel that we give, we talk about a thing called the sphere of control. So it doesn't mean that everything that they say in the learning team, the company's going to be able to click their fingers and rectify. So I'll I'll go out of this and I'll bring up an example of the report that we have. So this is from one that I did with the Lidcombe Service Centre. So very simple front page, the attendees. We had a couple of observers in there from BlueScope as well that were also wanting to understand learning teams. Context of the learning team. Next bit is about what are the key themes that emerged relevant to the original context. Okay, the original context here was yard operations at Lidcombe. And these are the key themes. So these are what we distill out of the individual comments. And we do that with the workers. So the learning team will go for 2 hours initially. You'll then have a break, which they call soak time. You'll then come back after the 2 hours for another couple of hours and start to put all this stuff together. So it's not a 3-day exercise. It's very quick. We then talk about any other themes that emerged out of the learning team, which you'll usually have a number. And then we put recommendations down. Now, out of these, we pick the first few actions out of the learning team itself straight away, so that because people are generally enthused. We do those actions though once we've called the service centre manager back into the room. I'll go through that in a second, but what I was talking about was, and some of you may have seen this before, we found this actually works really well in the learning teams to explain up front around the sphere of concern, sphere of control. So what we want to aim for is ideally actions that sit within our sphere of control. So we have at that facility have direct control on how to action them. We'll also note down anything that is within our sphere of influence. So we may need some outside help to address those actions. And also there may be some actions which are within our sphere of concern, which means we probably don't have any way of influencing the outcomes of those, but it's still worth noting and it's still a call out. And what this does up front, if people know this, then they can be a little bit more realistic on what that team is going to chase after initially. But that's an example of a learning team report that we put in. So as I say, we're all parts of organisations. We all need to be able to report on what we've done, and we found that was a nice simple way of doing that. What we also do is out of the learning teams is with our safety management database, we raise a report in that, and so we also track any actions that are raised out of the learning team through that database. As I said, at the end of the learning team, once the team is comfortable that they've got as far as they were going to get in the session, we call the service centre manager back into the room. And what we found is the important thing is we prep the participants to make sure that they look after the service centre manager, because they're coming into this not knowing the discussions that had been taken place. And we also prep the service centre manager to make sure that they listen without judgment. Okay, and because we've had sometimes some things come out of learning teams which are the service centre manager thinks they know their facility, and some things come out which are completely left field for them. And so we make sure that even if it is a bit of a shock, they listen without judgment. So some examples. The other thing to note with this is HOP is not about, and safety differently isn't about throwing out everything that you've done in the past. So we have a reasonable safety record at CHEP and Brambles, and the stuff that we've done in the past has got us to where we are, and so that is all useful. And what we found is going down this approach isn't about turfing everything out that we've done. It's about taking a fresh approach. I sort of liken safety differently and HOP to it's really a change in the thought process of the organisation, in the way that it actually looks at things that are happening within the organisation. So you can do the same, do similar things, you just do them in a slightly different way. So our stop for safety, so our walks where we would go for a walk with the workers and observe hazards and observe what we call unsafe behaviours. What traditionally do is map those back to a procedure, and so try and correct that behaviour. A change in our stop for safety walks, and these are very similar to the Take 45 walks that you see at the bottom there. With stop for safety, instead of saying we're going to stop and we're going to keep focused and that's going to keep us safe, well, that probably has about a 3-day impact, and then things are back to normal. What we do in the stop for safety is we have a conversation to say what procedures don't make sense. What are the things that you see that, okay, we're putting in a procedure and we say, yeah, okay, CHEP, that's all great, we'll just do it our way because we know that's crap. Okay, so challenge us on those things. On the Take 45 walks, we've changed those to be more of a conversation about, tell us about the things that are frustrating you in the workplace right now, and let's go for a walk out there and you take me through your day. So, so video observations, we were doing those where we would take a volunteer would volunteer for a 2-minute video on what they did, and we'd take that back to the toolbox meetings, and the team would actually discuss, okay, what are they doing correctly, what are they not doing correctly. And so again, it was that traditional mapping the behaviour back to what the standard procedure is. Changing the video observations up, we take the same video, but the conversation that the shift team can have in that sense is to have a discussion about what are the things that might be influencing the way that the person is working. So not whether they're working correctly or incorrectly, let's talk about the things that are actually generating the behaviours. Because once you understand that, you can actually start to change things. It also leads beautifully into some other models of leadership. This one really resonated with me. Some of you may have seen David Marquette's video about the ladder of leadership. Fundamentally, he talks about, he uses the example of a nuclear submarine, about providing competence and clarity and then giving control to your workers. So again, safety differently is about empowering and recognising that the experts in your process are actually the people closest to the process. And so if you look at this in a little bit more detail offline, it's a great video. It's one of those cartoon videos, but when you think about the principles of HOP and what you learn in HOP and safety differently, and then overlay that with the ladder of leadership, they work together beautifully. So we're not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. What mistakes did we make? So we got in the pilot program in Queensland, and as I say, we've got a couple of, well, Dave Hopner was with us at that time on the call, and we've got Melissa Evans on the call as well, who's still with us from Queensland. What we found was we got a big head of steam, and out of the learning teams, we had a program of so many learning teams within a 6-month period at all the sites in Brisbane, and we got inundated with actions. So one of the things you'll find out of a learning team is it generates an enormous amount of information in a very short space of time. And so what we had to pare back how many learning teams we were running in that sense. So less is more. And as I say, don't rush into this. For us, it's a slow burn, but I see it as being a very sustainable way of doing business. Just change the next slide. So how have we gone? Just in summary, so to this point, and some of these are a mix of Australia and ANZ, in the APAC region, Australia and New Zealand have had the most exposure to this. I have had a fairly light touch in the Asian countries at this point in time. My focus in say Malaysia has been just to coach the teams over there on how to ask different questions. And when they're talking with their teams, and when they're talking with say truck drivers coming onto their site, just ask them some different questions to get them to tell you a story about what their day is normally like, and they'll get insights into some of the things that might be challenges for them. So you don't need to run a formal learning team to do that. You just need to ask those open questions which promote stories. So some of the things, just a quick snapshot. We've done quite a bit of training, a number of people. It's hard to get everyone in the business trained. So we're sort of starting within our operations team and expanding out. We've had 313 actions across ANZ raised from learning teams so far. Our TRIFR is still flat. Okay, the wheels haven't fallen off because we've tried a new approach, so it's holding steady. But again, I'm not expecting. We've started with fairly low numbers, and as people would understand, when you're starting from low numbers, it is hard to see a step change. I think you would see probably much quicker results in the lag indicators in either a business that's having an enormous number of accidents and incidents, where there's a lot of low-hanging fruit, or potentially a smaller organisation where it's quicker to get that whole of business coming on board at once. But we're happy with that. What we are seeing in the numbers though is so our severity rates are coming down. So to give you an idea, our LTIFR is at 1.7, and the which is an improvement on last year. It's about half of last year, and our lost time injury severity rate is also half of what it was last year. So whilst the numbers of incidents are still flat, what we're seeing is the severity of those incidents is coming down. And when you look at your more severe incidents, the data from Safe Work Australia on looking at serious incidents where people have a week off or more. So we're running at about 0.9. Our rate is about 0.9, which is sort of equivalent to the financial and insurance services sector at the moment. So I'm very, very happy with how that's tracking. A couple of the really big call-outs was in our latest employee pulse survey. So we survey all the employees globally across Brambles. What we actually saw was a really interesting tick up in New South Wales and Queensland, which are the two regions globally that have had the most exposure to safety differently and HOP. And what we actually saw was a 5% step change in the question around their perception of how safety is managed at work, and we had a similar step change I think we had a 12% step change in their perception of how the company approaches continuous improvement. So, and that wasn't reflected in a number of the other regions. So it was specific to New South Wales and Queensland, which was really encouraging. The other big call out is a couple on the right hand side here. So very intentionally, HOP doesn't mean, and safety differently doesn't mean that you have to suspend all performance management action. Okay, and I intentionally told our leadership teams that I wasn't going to ask them to do anything in relation to that, but I would do my part to show them the full story around a particular incident when it did occur. And what we've actually seen is, with no changes in our HR policies, we've seen, as I say, a 67% reduction in all disciplinary action related to safety events, and a 75% reduction in people actually losing their jobs as a result of safety events. So as you can see, that in taking that approach, the wheels haven't fallen off. People just open their eyes and understand better what's going on. And lastly, where to now from CHEP? So we want to continue the expansion globally. So we need to do some work in India and Latin America with the next cabs off the rank with the rollout of this. We want to upskill more facilitators. It's critical that your facilitators are not just, you don't just throw anyone in there. They need to have a deep understanding of the HOP principles, and also they need to be able to facilitate a group. So we're going to continue to work on promoting just those informal HOP conversations. we want to progress to roll this out into the non-operations applications. Again, you can use this stuff in any situation where people are working within a process, whether that might be the finance team working within their processes, or people working within a procurement process. Okay, this stuff works. We'll continue to mentor the other global regions because we've had the most exposure over this way, and we're also doing some engagement with some other businesses that are, I suppose, why you're on the call at the moment, is just trying to get a better understanding on how they can start down this path and what we've done. And that is all I have as far as the presentation. Vanessa and Andy, if you guys wanted to, I'm not sure if anything's come through as far as questions and that goes, but happy to answer any questions that people have got at the moment.
I certainly have asked some questions, Craig, so we'll get cracking into those in just a moment. So thank you so much for that presentation. You had so many really great insights there that we can draw from. And I particularly loved how you talked about it's a change in thought process with the organisation. So that was really evident throughout what you've been doing. So we'll just get started on some of these questions.
Yep.
Phil asked about virtual teams. So have you used them? And if not, do you consider that it might be something you need to do in the future?
Virtual learning teams?
Correct, yeah.
The answer is no. It's I suppose we're the same as everyone. It's put a little bit of a, where we've tried to encourage facilities and managers at the moment is to have more of those informal conversations. Your learning team is a sort of more of a formal way of approaching it, and we've intentionally sort of tried to limit people getting in the one room. Again, with our what we've also done is we've prevented like my team and myself and that from going site to site at this time. So we haven't tried to venture down the virtual learning team path. It may be something we try, but it would it'd be an interesting experience. The thing with a learning team is the people that you're doing it with have to absolutely trust you and the process, because what happens is it doesn't blow up in your face in a learning team if it doesn't work. What happens is all you get is the stock standard type answers that you might get in some other type of team, and that's how you tell whether you've actually resonated with the participants or whether or not you've probably missed the mark.
Just on that, Craig, when we were in Florida last year and we had a group of managers together, Sarah was talking about some, I think it was called safety action teams they were doing in the United States, and she said, "Oh, you're already doing the learning teams." And there was something you said which just really stuck with me at the time, which I think was a really great kind of differentiator between anything else in a learning team. Do you want to share what that was?
Yeah, so we're in Orlando, and they said we're doing a whole heap of these learning teams, and I sort of had the sense that maybe they weren't getting underneath where they should. And so good test of a learning team is if you are hearing things in a learning team that would normally get the participants sacked, then you're probably doing the right thing. Okay, if they're not opening up fully about things that would get them fired under normal circumstances, then they're holding back. So as an example, I've had people in learning teams over here that have talked about doing themselves a knee injury and not wanting to report it because they didn't want to let their workers down, and this would be a TRIFA type injury, and that stuff only comes out when they have absolute faith in the process. But it's a good gauge of a learning team on what you're actually hearing in there.
Yeah, I really like that.
Thanks for that. Dave Hopner has just touched on disciplinary action. So he says it's good to see the reduction in disciplinary action and dismissals. That was one of the early goals we had in place.
Yep.
Is there a benchmark to determine when you use a team approach as opposed to a straight disciplinary approach or ICAM approach following an incident? Who is involved in this determination or assessment of when to use, and how do you document the investigative approach of a team for incidents?
Yeah, so no, good question, Dave. So look, in the early days with learning teams, the way we started was so that we can better generate that atmosphere of trust, we started learning teams in situations where there was no incident. Okay, so we would just pick a topic of concern and we do a learning team. What we then, when we started to progress to incident-based learning teams, we would pick an incident where there would really be no potential personal implications for those involved in the type of incident. And then as people got more confident in the process, we've then sort of been dipping our toes in those incidents where it's an absolute, traditionally a violation of a procedure that has someone potentially in the crosshairs. You won't be able to do it in those situations in the early days because people need to actually trust in the process. But when we do, we need to, it's the business making a commitment to say that they actually really want to understand all the things that happened in this case. So as far as the investigations, if it is an investigation, if it's a learning team that we've done, we use a learning team report. Some investigations, we've said, look, we may not get anything out of a learning team here. We'll do a more of a standard ICAM based approach. We haven't got any hard and fast rules on which one, but generally when I see an incident that where you know that there's something underlying the incident from a behavioural point of view, or if it's an incident that isn't an absolute behaviour which has been that initial sort of trigger for the incident, they're generally the ones that you want to do a learning team on. But yeah, the write-up it's either an ICAM write-up or it's a learning team write-up with those. And again, I still haven't gone to the point with HR or the leadership, country leadership teams and said I want to change human resources or performance management policies. The other thing to note with this is, safety differently is not the death of performance management. Okay, performance management is still valid. You just need to make sure that you've got the whole picture. Okay, when you're talking about improving performance, and the whole picture means you need to understand the influences that are at play in the workplace, which are also driving performance. But there are some people that are a square peg in a round hole, and if terminating a person, if there's been a continuation of behaviours that you've done everything you could to try and change the influences at play in the workplace, and the person just does not want to come along for the journey, then what you're probably doing is saving them from themselves. And in that case, I believe it's justified to part ways with that person, or you may move roles. Okay, it may not be a termination, but you may have to take them out of that particular role because they may not be able to operate safely within that role. So that's still okay with this stuff. But what we have found is in most cases where we would have defaulted to the performance management, we've been able to better understand the factors that actually drove the behaviour and then fix those factors instead.
I think there was just on that, Craig, as well, something there was a discussion quite early on, I think even at the pilot, I think, because we were discussing that when we were going through the whole second principle, blame fixes nothing. And as in every organisation, some of the managers got quite uncomfortable, like, okay, well, where do we draw the line? And I think one of the things you said, which is quite useful at the time, was, well, anything that people do in the course of trying to get the job done, that's the kind of stuff we're interested in, and we're going to that's where we're really going to be focusing on this blame fixes nothing. But people who kind of, I think the term used like horseplay or tricks and gags and stuff like that, it's kind of like, well, you're rolling the dice, then it's kind of fair game.
Yeah, I think it's that is where I try and rationalise it for the business. It's this stuff applies to anything where a person, no matter how ridiculous it might seem of what they've done, if they were doing it in the course of trying to do their job, then we need to actually look without judgment and try and understand the reasons for that. If someone's, I don't know, surfing a pallet down a conveyor or something like that, that's got nothing to do with doing your job. Okay, so that's horseplay or fighting and things like that. Nothing to do with doing your job. And I sort of don't see an application for this stuff in those situations.
Yeah, because that's what I think what people worry sometimes. Oh, this is free reign. It's just like free reign now. People can do what they want, but I think that's a very reasonable and pragmatic kind of position to take.
Yeah, well, as I say, our results, even though we're starting from a fairly low number, so it's difficult to see a step change in the lag indicators, but the wheels haven't fallen off in CHEP. So and even with that very, very different lens through the performance management process, so you don't need to be scared of taking the leap.
Cool.
Thanks, guys. We have a few more questions. I guess just kind of building on that one, Balaz has asked, how you get that trust that you need if you don't have it originally?
So again, one of the things, one of the really important things is no one in the learning team, in the line of management, in the chain of command. So that's a really good start. So just bring someone in independent to talk to them, or it might be, someone who the workers would traditionally trust, from outside. It doesn't need to be from operations. It could be a salesperson or someone who has just a real knack for facilitation. But that will actually help build that trust. The other thing we find though is, and I've seen this in a few learning teams where initially people are quiet. They don't want to talk, and so it takes generally 15 to 20 minutes for people to actually start to understand that they actually can open up. So, and I did one in Bathurst where one of the guys in there was, I'd known the Bathurst team. It's only a very small team, and I'd known who the guys were for a lot of years. And I knew this one guy who was traditionally a fairly cynical bloke or whatever. And I said to the service centre manager, I want him in the learning team, okay? Because generally your most outspoken people, and the ones that traditionally might have thought are a pain in the bum, they're generally the best people to have in there, because once they get going to talk about what their experience is really like, again, it's that richness of information that flows. It just takes them a little while to warm up.
Thanks, Craig. Great. We have one just around safety indicators. So what different safety indicators does CHEP use now, and what did CHEP do differently for safety procedures after you implemented HOP? So
two different questions there. So look, on the KPIs, CHEP and Brambles is a big ship to turn. Okay, so we are trying to influence the business to move away from personal objectives of lag indicators like TRIFR. But at the moment, they still have it. And look, I think most businesses will still do that, because a lot of businesses will report that in their reports to the stock market and so forth as well. It forms part of our sustainability report for the business. So that will still be there, but the sorts of things that I'm trying to, on that one slide that I brought up, you saw some of the things in there, measuring, what's your, if you commit to training, what's your compliance like to what the training is like, or the training expectations within the business. And also action completion rate is another really good one. So actions are good because we are currently measuring, and as part of the Australian business plan is getting an 80% completion rate by the due date for any action raised out of a learning team, specifically a learning team. And the reason that's so important is because in a learning team, you've built the trust with the participants. When you commit to something and the service centre manager commits to say, right, we're going to go after this, it is so important to hit that due date, because it means you're following through on your commitment to your people. So things like, as I said, training compliance, action completion rate, participation in, hazard identification or learning teams. So how many different people are involved in learning teams within the business? So it's looking at measures of safety capacity So if any of you have done the safety differently or HOP training, they talk about the measure of safety is not the absence of incidents, it's actually the presence of capacities. So Todd Conklin talks a lot about that. And so finding ways of measuring safety capacity and sentiment within the business is a good measure of whether you're getting that success. So employee engagement as well. So those pulse surveys that I talked about, safety within CHEP, safety is consistently one of the highest rating questions in the global survey. Okay, so some of those are more of the proactive measures that you can use to understand, you know, are we getting traction?
Nice, thanks, Craig.
Yep.
I know you have touched on this one a little bit. So does CHEP do accident investigation?
Sorry, I didn't answer that. There was a second part to that one about procedures, and I'll cover that very quickly. So we haven't changed our procedures at the moment, and this is one thing that we're trying to work through. The premise of safety differently is about understanding that adaptation is necessary day to day, hour to hour to get the job done. Traditionally, our procedures are written in step 1 through to step 10 to say, and then naively thinking that everyone out in the factory follows step 1 through to step 10 every time they repair a pallet or wash a bin or something, right? Which is just a farcical. So what we're trying to understand is how we can write the procedures with covering off, and it may be just covering off the critical control points of what are the hazards that if you don't do these, there's immediate consequences as far as risk. And then writing the rest of the procedure in a way that recognising the adaptation that's going to be necessary to allow that. And in that way, your procedure better mirrors how people need to work on the floor. That's my thoughts anyway, but we're not there yet. Our safety management system still looks very much like it did 5 years ago. So.
I think that goes to the point of Craig.
Thanks.
Integration is a process. It isn't something that happens overnight. It's kind of a continuous process. It's a phased thing. So it's, you know, anyone is thinking, oh well, we're going to start doing this hop thing. It takes time.
And look, very quickly, a comment that was made to me by some lawyers that I was in a briefing with. We actually were talking about this, and I was giving them a briefing on HOP and safety differently. I said, what does it mean from a regulatory point of view if you know, we sort of recognise this adaptation? And their comment, which again has really stuck with me, they said one of the things that will more often than not bring a company undone in court is when they present their beautiful safety management system and all their procedures and the training that they've done with their people, and then they put a worker in the witness box and says, well, that's all good, but this is what we actually do. When that happens, it all unravels. And so safety differently is a way of recognising that adaptation and understanding what's actually happening on the floor, so you can better mirror what needs to occur.
Yeah, I think a lot of people kind of, in ignorance, believe this equates to more legal risk, acknowledging kind of like that blue line. But we've talked about that before, Craig, and obviously there's the stuff out there from Greg Smith, the book Paper Safe, where he talks about that kind of interesting sort of position where actually less may be more in terms of legal protection.
Yep.
Nice, thanks, guys. Look, as I said, you have touched on this, and I'm aware of the time. We've got a couple of minutes left. Does CHEP do an accident investigation, and if yes, what tool? So it sounds like you had a couple of separate approaches.
Yeah, so traditionally it was ICAM. ICAM has been a tool for eons that we've used. It was a tool that we used in BHP and Bluescope as well. What we're doing is trying to move from ICAM to a learning team approach as a way of better understanding. Because what we find is ICAM, you start at the event and you work backwards. In a learning team, you start way before the event and you work towards the event in understanding normal work. What we find is you actually get way better information out of a learning team than you do with a traditional ICAM investigation, because you tend to be a little bit more blinkered when you do an ICAM to some of the peripheral things that may be having a contributory effect, or even things that are just great learnings that you're going to learn along the way. So.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. We have one more. How do you measure the average improved safety score?
Not sure which safety score you're talking about with that one.
It was on that series of metrics you talked about, and you mentioned that since you've been doing HOP, you've seen an increase of 5%. I think.
Sorry, that was off the employee survey, the global employee survey. So if you're in a company that does these global surveys, Pulse or Glint or whatever the third parties that facilitate these, you get a score. So it's the mechanics of the third party, how they calculate all that. So I don't know the exact calculations, but it's based on, are the responses more favourable, or are the responses more of a detracting nature according to that individual question?
Great, thanks for clarifying, Craig. I'm very aware that we're up with time, so it's now 5 o'clock. So we may leave it there. I just want to extend another huge thank you, Craig, for joining us and sharing all these insights and all the fabulous work you've been doing with CHEP in your slow burn. It's been amazing to hear some of these outcomes and stories that you've collected along the way.
Yep.
Yeah, thanks very much, Craig. Sorry to talk over you there, Nessa, but it's been great to have you talk about some of your experience, and from a perspective, from our Southpac perspective, it's been awesome to see the progress you guys have made over the last 18 months. It's been, phenomenal. So great job to you and your team.
Thanks, Andy.